Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Uplifting Impact Podcast. I'm Justin Ponder, Chief Information Officer with the Uplifting Impact team, and I'm excited to be hosting you today as we dive deeper into the journey to make the world more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Today, I'm very excited to be talking with Raj Verma. He joined Sanofi in December 2020, heading up diversity, equity, and inclusion, culture, and employee experience. Raj is determined to make an impact in the workplace while nurturing a culture that thrives on a diverse workforce at every level of the organization, ensuring that underrepresentation is systematically addressed and employees feel engaged and proud to belong. He has over 25 years of global HR transformation and change leadership experience, which comes from having held both specialist and generalist HR leadership roles at the country, regional, and international level in organizations such as Ford Motor Company, Jaguar Land Rover Cars, and most recently, Sodexo, where he was Global Senior Vice President of Human Resources. Raj lives in the UK, is married, and has 2 teenage children, and we are told 1 very naughty dog. Raj Verma, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Justin, and nice to be here.
Thank you. So our first question that we love to ask everyone is, what brings you joy?
Look, I think there are 2 things that really bring me joy. One is people. I'm very much a people person. I love being around others. I love being part of something new and different, and seeing something, the conversation turning into something different. So that really excites me. Just, stick me in a room by myself for a day and I would go, a little bit stir crazy, but put me with a group of people, I absolutely thrive. And the second big thing that really brings me joy is seeing the changes being made from an idea to where we started, to where we are now, to where we aspire to be in that whole journey. I love seeing that story unfold. And for me, people and progress, I'd say, were probably the 2 big things that bring me joy, and for that reason, both at work and at home.
In your answer there, you mentioned you love being around people and watching the differences that are made, that you kind of bring something up and then somebody adds to it and it becomes different. And then you also mentioned change. What advice would you give to people who, that sounds terrifying, that I like to come up with ideas in a vacuum, and then the idea that I have to interact with people and there's all these unpredictable changes? What would you say to those folks for whom being around people, thriving off of the difference, the surprise, and the improvisation that has to happen with other people, where that's maybe not their skill set? How would you have them think about it in a different way?
Look, I think when you're in a group environment, you got your ideal is to have a mix of people, with different preferences. Some will be far more extroverts, some will be more introverted and guarded. And I think part of being in a team is to help people feel included. And I think, ask the questions, right? Ask people what's going to work for them. What sort of ideas have they got, and leverage their strengths. So if they love writing things down on a piece of paper or on a book, take it, right? Take it and rebuild it into another part of the conversation, so we don't lose the essence of the thinking, right? So I think that's what we really want to strive for, that everybody has a voice, whether they like to vocalize it or internalize it. Our role, especially as leaders or managers of a group, is to be able to bring that out so everyone feels that they've brought their very best self to that conversation, and to find tools and techniques to help them engage in a different way. And nothing is right and wrong, right? So for me, try everything, right? Find different ways of experimenting, so that nobody feels as if they haven't had the opportunity to put something into that mix.
And in this experiment of trying everything, what's one thing that you've tried that you were nervous about but worked out really well?
Look, I think being bold is something that every leader has to get comfortable with, and being comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. So I think, when I first started, certainly in the D&I space, having some of those uncomfortable conversations with people was always a how do I start? What do I say? What if I say things wrong? And I always assume positive intent. And I think part of that gives me the courage of humility to say, actually, I don't know what I don't know, so help me understand. One of the things that we did in Brazil, actually, a few weeks ago, I was in a meeting with the leadership. And one of the things they do to make people feel included is to say a little bit about themselves, what their pronouns are, what they look like, a little bit about their background. So everybody feels, part of that conversation. And that was quite alien to me at the start. So I took my brave pill and I went in and shared a little bit more than what I probably would normally in a group of, 50, 60 odd people that I didn't know. But that's what they expected from a presenter, from a leader, to be able to be that open. So you have to sort of climatize yourself to those different environments and do the best you can.
I love that word, climatize. And I love the example that you gave too about not just differences. And an initial answer, you talked about differences, introversion versus extroverted, differences in personality. But the example you just gave was differences across international cultures. And that brings us to a valuable question. Most of the people that we talk to are in the US and they focus on US issues. But how would you say the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging change when you're talking about global workforce training conversations?
Look, I think one of the things that you have to really think about is that, when we built our D&I strategy in Sanofi, we built it as a globally transversal strategy. And what that means is that we have a global frame, very clear. We have some clear objectives for 2025. But the way to deliver it is through local planning, a local D&I plan. So all of our countries have been creating their local D&I plans that ladder up into a global strategy, because local markets with local context, you need local allies. And one of the things that we learned right at the beginning was that, it's important to recognize that everybody is at a different point in their own journey for different reasons, right? And I think what we've tried to do is to bring as much of that into the conversation. So, when you're building a global approach, you also have to set very clear measures. So you can see, what can you do that signals progress and what can you help storytell? Because those stories in one country are translatable to other countries. So you always have a global vision, but the execution has to be local because it is so differently contextualized country by country. And that's what we have to lean into. And that's why it's really important to think through different ways of getting into different countries and recognizing that countries will dial up or dial down some of the things that maybe you aspire to do globally. And that's okay.
And you mentioned this kind of necessary conversation between the global and the local.
Yeah.
And maybe taking it one step further, how do you go about making this conversation between your entire organization on an international level, but also make it feel personal? So even harder than the conversation between the global and the local, how do you make the conversation between the international or the entire organization and the personal?
Yeah. Well, let me just share with you a bit of what we did in Sanofi. And, when we were looking at our D&I strategies, which we launched in June last year, it was the first real global D&I strategy that we had launched. It was built with the business. So, I'm a firm believer of co-creation is key, because then you get different voices in the room. And as we started to bring in perspectives and lived experiences, that started to form a relatively good framework. But, the key thing for us is that you need trust. And that's what we were trying to build right at the start. So it becomes more about we than I, right? So that's your first building block, right? So bring different perspectives in the room from different parts of the world. So you've got a legitimacy to be able to talk and think global. The second thing that we did to really bring this to life was we created a global D&I network of people, who were our local allies. We have global pinpoints, right? But the execution has to be tailored to local need, local capability, and those local influencers around the topic. We listened, we learned, we asked what would land well, what do they see as getting in the way of some of the things that we may want to do, and what lessons have already been learned. And what this did was allow us to frame things in a far better and a far more elegant way, because we were putting ourselves in the shoes of the people who we're trying to reach out to. So, my team is very small. And when people ask me, how many people do you have in your team? I say I have 100,000 people in my team. Right? Because every single person in the organization has a vested interest. Yeah. And will be impacted by the work we do around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So we have to bring them into that conversation, and the other big thing is the proof points, so we're building a whole library of great case studies and examples that countries have done. But what we're doing is we're sharing those across the organization, and we're sharing those externally. And it was amazing, when you engage with local teams, that many felt, oh, these stories aren't worthy of global recognition, but how wrong that they are, because they absolutely were, right? Wow. And the big piece for us is, we launched global parental leave, which is 14 weeks consistently around the world for anyone who's having a baby, who is adopting, or having a child through surrogacy, regardless of where you are in Sanofi. Regardless of what the laws say in your country, you will get no less than 14 weeks paid leave. And that, we had a global frame, but each country then started to execute it. But we had a minimal viable product, as they say, which is the 14 weeks. And that has received so much positivity from within the organization, but also externally, because it's a great, wow, if Sanofi are doing this and you're really listening to your people, that's a company I want to work with. Right. And we did the same with our approach to flexible working. The pandemic has really shifted our approach to our culture in the workplace. So we've created a global framework and helped each country build their own policy around that. Right. Well-being is exactly the same. A global framework with some key factors. For example, that we would give access to every single employee to an employee assistance program online everywhere. But lots of well-being activity could also be nurtured in country. So everything we've done, we've tried to do it with our employees, our colleagues, our teams in mind, so that when we start the conversation, it's always co-owned, right?
Yes.
And everyone has a role to play, because the work of DE&I will impact us all in one way, shape, or form, whether we want to have it impact us or not. So we may as well be part of the conversation than not, right? So that's how we've really brought the whole of Sanofi together around this topic. And we're right at the infancy of our journey. So we're learning as we go. But it's that constant feedback, that constant engagement, recognizing when we have to dial things up and dial things down. But essentially, everything is connected. I always say that DE&I is not about bolting things on. It's about building things in. So that's what we've tried to do every step of the way. Every policy we'll look at, every employee experience touch point we create, the work we're doing around culture and behaviors, integrating inclusion indicators so that managers know what good looks like. Right. So this is not a standalone piece. This is a real sort of back and forth.
And you provided like a lot of really valuable lessons of what you've learned along the way. So this is going to be a tough question. In your 25 years of work, what would you say is the most valuable lesson that you've learned? So we'll go really broad. That would maybe help people listening and inspire them to keep going as well. What's perhaps the most important lesson you've learned?
Gosh, I've learned so many lessons, and I have so much more to learn. But the one thing that I remember a CEO of mine once telling me, and right at the infancy of my career, was that there aren't many rights or wrongs, right? Just points of difference. And as a leader, it's my role to invest in finding those points of difference. So I have to be a citizen of the world, right? So for me, that has always held true in every role that I've done, because it makes it more inclusive, and you're not defending a point, you're trying to understand a point. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that, assume positive intent, right? Every step of the way, because again, it helps the conversation. It helps you find a more progressive solution. And I know I'm cheating. You've asked me for the one big thing, but
you can give multiples.
the other thing that I've really lived by is humility, right? Yeah. Like many, I'm learning as I go. I'm not a D&I expert, for example. I've been in the D&I space in various roles that I've been in, but it's about knowing that there's so much that I don't know, and listening as much as I'm sharing. And when you do that, it starts to help you shape that. What you realize is that you can't get everything done without others. So you have to bring more conversations and voices into your decision making. So having that level of humility helps you ask for that help. And finally, I always say to myself, so what? If I'm doing this, so what? Where am I making the difference? Right? What's the impact to the organization, to the individual, to society, to the community I'm in? That's so what is a really powerful word for me anyway.
And so you've mentioned so much that you've learned and that you're learning. And I guess the last question that I'd like to ask is, what's most interesting to you now? What's kind of pulling your attention? What are you learning most specifically now?
So, I'm new to the pharma industry. And over the past 12 months or so, I've really tried to get my head into the space of, it's a noble industry, right? So we're doing great stuff for many people. And you can see many pharma organizations, especially with COVID, and how they've really been the main sort of solution to helping us find a way out of COVID. But as I'm starting to understand a little bit more about the healthcare industry, I'm starting to learn a little bit about health inequity. I'm learning, in pharma, what does it mean to have inclusive clinical trials, right? And what's the whole space around mental health when it comes to pharmaceutical and healthcare? How do we make sure that we give access to information and education to people who may not ordinarily have that access? And where does digital come into pharmaceutical activity, to biotech, to the healthcare space, right? So all of these themes that are industry-wide are things that I'm starting to get a slightly better understanding of it. And what can I and we do within the industry, within Sanofi, to make that difference? Even if it's a small difference, it will have a big impact because we're global. We have a global footprint, and part of our I guess competitive advantage is that we can get to places faster than others. So what can we do to help society as well? And the other big piece is, how inextricably linked diversity, equity, inclusion is to the CSR agenda and the impact we have on society, and how do we join up some of those dots. So that's the learning I'm going through as I start to familiarize myself with an industry that I've not been in before.
Well, you're learning quite a lot, but you've taught us even more, and we appreciate Raj Verma. So thanks for being with us. And how can our folks out there continue to stay in touch with you?
I'm very happy to connect with me on LinkedIn. Always have to share a story. You'll see a lot more coming through the Sanofi world, through LinkedIn, through Instagram, through our different pages on Twitter. But LinkedIn's the easiest way to find me and get in touch.
All right, sounds great. And we'll be sure to put that in the notes for our listeners. So Raj Verma, thank you very much again.
It's a pleasure and good to chat with you, Justin.
And thank you to all of you out there listening. We're so glad you were able to tune in this week for our episode of the Uplifting Impact podcast. And we need more people like you to continue to uplift the impact. And in order to do so, be sure to share this episode, comment on it on our website at upliftingimpact.com, or provide your thoughts directly to us through LinkedIn at Uplifting Impact, looking for Justin Ponder or Deanna Singh. And until next week, keep uplifting the impact.